Hey Andrew, how are you?
Hey, how are you? I'm doing well.
Doing well as well. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me today. Why don't we start off with you introducing yourself, your name, and your role, please?
Awesome. Well, my name is Andrew McRae. I have the great honor and privilege of being the Chief Academic Officer at Breakthrough Public Schools here in Cleveland, Ohio.
Nice. And Andrew, you've had a pretty impressive career. Why don't we talk to us about your journey in the field of education?
Wow, my journey. So my journey started with actually Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where I was in college at the time and understood the sort of unique impact that that hurricane would have on young people in New Orleans. And so I signed up after graduation for Teach for America. I, like many other folks across the country, went off to communities, but for me, it was specifically wanting to support communities impacted by Hurricane Katrina that found me in Southwest Houston, where I was a teacher, a grade level chair, a department chair. I earned a master's degree during that period and eventually became Dean of Instruction at a charter network in Houston. Following that, I made a pretty a rapid ascension into school leadership from Dean of Instruction to principal, where I was a principal for several years, eventually becoming executive director of a known national charter network in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I did that for several years. And now I have the great honor to lead Breakthrough Public Schools as its first chief academic officer. I came to Breakthrough originally as a model education leader because we were structured differently. And my sort of first big task was to help us reimagine schooling in the way that we have been doing it here at Breakthrough, to move through an initiative we call the Better Together initiative, which took our sort of siloed structure and made it a centralized, cohesive CMO. And the idea is that all kids and all staff deserve the benefit of our collective wisdom and our collective resources. And I've been doing that work for the past few years.
Nice. And when it comes to all students, I mean, what opportunities do you see to be even more bold and unapologetic in sort of preparing our students and our communities to reach their innate potential?
I think that there are, in my opinion, sort of three big opportunities on the horizon. So I think one is that there's an opportunity for innovation around in-school and or virtual tutoring as a lever for helping to accelerate student learning and student growth. We now know more than we've known. We've gone faster and farther in the last 2 years than we've gone in 10 years around ed tech and ability to leverage technology to drive academic gain for kids. And we see that being leveraged so thoughtfully and so methodically at school networks all across the country. What we know is when we map teacher and talent development with strong tech resources and support and investment with kids, scholars, and families, that we see academic gain.
No.
I would say the second place that I think is a huge horizon for us as educators and as leaders is the ability to invest in student identity development through socio-emotional learning, through programs and resources that build student understandings both of who they are and how the world sees them and impacts their ability and choices in this life. And we know that that work can begin as early as kindergarten and first grade by teaching kids about difference and helping them understand the world from their perspective and affirming who they are and who their identity is, and can go as far as seniors in high school as they prepare to engage in this world for the first time as adults, but also as people of color in the legal sense. And then I would say the third place that I think there's a huge opportunity for all of us now in the education space is to think about talent and compensation differently. Like, we have always been in crisis as a profession. It is a profession that is undervalued, it is a profession that is undercompensated, it is a profession that is underfunded. But what has become incredibly clear by the pandemic is that great talent in positions of leadership, great talent in our classrooms, great talent is a game changer for what that can mean for our schools and communities. And what we see by removing so many of the barriers to entry for great talent to come into the profession is that we see innovation at a scale we've never seen it before. And I think that what's exciting there is that there's a chance for us, if we don't miss the moment, to really think about how do we elevate and invest in this profession so that we're not losing great people to other sectors, so that people can do adjacent work and get all of the benefits that come with it. this is our window to say, you know what? No, let's reimagine compensation. Let's reimagine support. Let's reimagine funding so that we can keep great people in our schools, because as they choose differently, we're going to see the spillover effects over the next several years.
Yeah. And you made a good point about sort of this investment, right? And so how do you, or what can school systems do to better recruit, develop, and retain educators of color?
So I think this is a great question. And so I think the first thing around like recruiting and retaining educators of color, let's start with recruiting. One, you have to make it a welcoming place for educators of color to be. That includes making it explicit that that is who you are going after. And it's because that they share background identity with students, or just because diversity equals a better workforce and we know it to be scientifically true, right? Like that is something we know to be true. So let's recruit them. I would say the second is making sure that onboarding, what I would call soil tilling. So it's not just onboarding someone to the organization, but making sure that your organization is truly ready for diverse perspectives to be in the room. Newsflash, no one is ready, but get ready because it has to happen. And so you have to till the soil, do the work around diversity and equity, make sure that you understand what racism is, what microaggressions are, make sure there's a shared understanding and a common knowledge of the facts of systemic oppression and structural racism, and confront those things as an organization while also attracting people. Because you can't attract teachers of color into an environment that's going to be hostile to them, right? So you have to be able to say, we are doing this work. We are going mirror before a magnifying glass, and we want you to come along on that journey and help us, not teach us, right? Because that is not the burden of staff members of color. But I want to talk a little bit about retention, if I may.
Sure.
When I think about retention, I think that there are two big parts to that. I think there's first, structural change. One of the biggest barriers for leaders of color is that things like negotiating and the lack of transparency and undefined pathways and non-criterion reference hiring practices always historically discriminate against women and people of color. What we know longitudinally is that when a process is more transparent and less opaque, that people of color tend to thrive and will stay in those organizations longer. So the first thing we have to do is create structural change to say, how do I make my hiring, compensation, recruitment practices as transparent as possible? How do I make the things that I'm looking for in great talent as clear as possible so that when people come to us, we can articulate what we're looking for in both observable and unobservable ways. And then a leader and or a teacher of color can then see those things and say, okay, that aligns to my values and the thing that I'm excited about. So that's the structural component. But then I think there is a leadership component here as well. And the leadership choice is to say, I have to be willing to ask difficult questions, look at hard data, and do the work that is necessary in order to ensure that all of my employee groups are being treated with dignity, that they feel connected to the work, that they have someone at work that they can talk to, who they feel that cares about them. And if necessary, and the data compels it so, be willing to make drastic changes to how we engage with multiple employee groups. And that latter point, that leadership change piece is hard.
It is.
Right? I can only speak from my experience because as a leader of color who also sits in the room that makes important leadership decisions, I have to be prepared to say, this is how people who look like me are being impacted, and we have to do something about that. And that duality, that dual pressure is something that I think is unique to leaders of color in some of these seats, but is absolutely necessary to driving whole-scale organizational change.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you say to folks whose solution has been to hire a DEI leader? And of course, we all know, as you mentioned, that's important work. We also mentioned that leaders at all levels need to be comfortable having these hard conversations. Folks have made an incredible investment, right, to start those conversations. But for folks who have outsourced that role, so to speak, what advice would you give them?
So I would say two things. I think that there is a role to be played for formal knowledge building. And I think that outsourcing to professionals whose expertise is helping to build a shared understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, what we're talking about when we're talking about anti-racism, what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic oppression. I think that there's a role to be played there, and I think that that role is outsourceable and can even be placed on, in terms of knowledge building, and the collateral associated with it, an individual in many of these roles that have popped up across the country. I guess what I would advise, however, is that that is necessary but insufficient to drive the change. I would say that you also then need to build along with that, in partnership with it, really, I would say, is a way to cascade that work into every aspect of the organization's being. So that's from, how do our hiring practices reflect that commitment to diversity and investment? How do we make contract decisions? Who gets contracts? Who gets our financial resources in that way? How do we think about input across those stakeholder groups? And those, to me, require leadership decisions from either the school, the chief level, and others to say, we're going to use the mirror before the magnifying glass and ensure that it doesn't, a well-meaning, well-intended shift doesn't become tokenism, because we have failed to invest in the structural change.
Yeah. You mentioned before that the state of education has been a crisis, right, for quite some time. And, we've gotten some things right, but there are a lot of things left to fix, to make better, and to improve. Where should we as a sector go next in terms of the fixes and the changes and improvements we need to make in order to make good on our promises to students and families?
I think it's a big question, and I think it's going to vary from situation to situation, but I do think there are some big strokes.
Sure.
Well, one, there are some things we on the whole got right? There is room for us to say, hey, there are normed standards that all kids need to know and be able to do, that kids need to be able to learn, and that is universal. And continuing to invest in that body of work is, I think, meaningful, and holding a standard that's normed, that is an absolute bar, not a relative one, right? The standard for what kids need to know and be able to do should be the same in Mississippi as it is in Texas, as it is in Ohio, because all of these students are promised under the constitutions of their states, thorough and efficient and adequate public education. And so we should continue to do that work there. I think the next phase, however, will feel a little bit backwards. I actually think we have to think about the adults first. I think that we have to ask ourselves, how do we build ecosystems where adults can thrive and students can be set up to learn the most? And that may mean challenging some of our previous assumptions. That may mean saying, hey, can we leverage technology in a way that allows us to put our best teachers and have their impact expanded across more scholars? Is there a way to rethink our model around service delivery to say, you know what, is it possible to have an expert educator lead a main lesson and have other educators who might not be as skilled or might not be as experienced just do support lessons that allow students to all receive the core instruction together, but to have other educators who can bring them along in their sort of individual focused skills and needs. I think that interrogating service delivery, thinking about educational talent and talent planning are two big places where I think going next will allow us to be able to get the flywheel going that we're going to need in order to be able to build great schools for all kids. And I think the third space that we need to go to, and I even hesitate to say it out loud because of how nonsensical the discussion has become. But we have to get our arms around and stop getting distracted by these public debates about things that don't have to do with K-12 education. We have to put ourselves in the focus of how are we ensuring that the kids in our schools and in our communities are learning the most, period, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from. And everything else, everything that people are using to get elected and everything that's fodder and everything that's mess, that we can put aside to make sure that we're making good decisions that ensure every single scholar has the opportunity to attain an excellent education.
Amen to that. Andrew, I'd like to take our focus to the school level for a moment. As you mentioned, you are helping to oversee a network with quite a number of schools. And what are you finding to be the common thread when it comes to leadership roles and their current needs, specifically the school principal?
So I think that there are a couple of trends that we see across sort of the school leadership landscape. I would say the first is that it's incredibly hard, right? The pandemic, as any school systems leader will tell you, was incredibly challenging, and school principals will tell you it's been grueling and backbreaking, and that is hard, which is leading to, of course, a crisis of talent in the sector in those roles that are proximate to kids and families, which are principals, teachers, etc. But I think there are a few things. So I would say, one, identifying and being able to hold on to school leadership talent is one of the biggest levers across the country right now. How do we keep our best principals, and how do we keep them in the seat of principal specifically so that their school can continue to thrive?
Sure.
Secondly, for our mid-level leaders, so think of assistant principals, deans, whatever you call them in your school model, how do we prepare them to be ready to be principals next? Because what we have right now is a talent gap, and we have leaders who, in many cases, are underdeveloped and or professionally immature at the management's level of leadership, which means that these sort of quote unquote battlefield promotions have propelled them throughout the pandemic to the seat of principal. Well, the seat of principal is really the CEO of a multi-million-dollar enterprise with large groups of employees. And so we have to be thinking about leadership development different. That will be the second big rung, I would say, is like leadership development of mid-management leaders and emerging leaders. And I would say the third, and the thing that I think was we kind of knew was coming, we knew it was in the ether, but there was no world where we were all prepared for it, was the impact of and then the continual impact of the pandemic on student mental health and staff mental health and the associated behaviors. At the school level, the number one thing, even above the immense staffing challenges, even above the immense leadership challenging, are student behavior crises, mental health crises and issues, and the ongoing need for support, therapy, counseling, and observation for students who have really struggled throughout this pandemic.
Yes.
And I want to be clear, because I know this is being recorded and I don't want to be sliced wrong. I want to be clear. That is not to say that we are blaming students for those behaviors. Right. But it is to say that we as the adults in the community did not adequately design the ecosystem to say when these behaviors present themselves, how will we identify, track, and respond to those behaviors, and then follow up to ensure that those behaviors improve for those kids.
Absolutely. Andrew, this is my last question, but I think an important one. As we look, you mentioned, no matter what your school model is, we all have a responsibility to make sure that each of these roles of leadership are well trained to retain them. But what makes an effective leader?
I think that there are three things, in my opinion, that makes an effective leader. I would say one, a person who has vision and a commitment to that vision. I say to my leaders all the time, your ultimate loyalty is to kids, and that has to be the thing that drives our work. Right. I would say second, that they are a reflective practitioner who responds to feedback. None of us were experts, right? I was a first year principal before. I was a first day principal before. I was a first day teacher. I was a first year teacher before. But the ability to take knowledge, feedback, wisdom, and continuously increase your effectiveness day after day is the thing that I think separates those effective leaders and effective teachers from ineffective leaders and ineffective teachers. And I would say, lastly, the ability to humbly communicate and to execute basic management practices. There are few things that are more harmful to a school than an ineffective teacher or an ineffective leader. And the mechanisms necessary to manage that impact, to help those people improve, and if necessary, liberate them from the context of educating our babies, is an important part of maturity that comes with all levels of leadership. And I think being able to put those three things together is where we're going to see our most effective leaders over time.
Andrew, thank you so much for your fearless, bold, and humble leadership. I'm sure this will help many, many, many across the country. So thank you.
Thank you. And it's been an honor and a privilege to spend some time with you today.
Likewise. Thank you.